Could the Salamanca family actually survive the real DEA? The Salamanca family is straight up one of the most violent criminal families in TV history, from Hector's ruthless leadership to Tuco sniffing his own product, and the cousins who just murder everyone in their way without even saying a word. They built a drug empire through pure fear and brutality. But here's what we're really asking today. Could these guys actually survive against the real DEA? We're breaking down the entire Salamanca operation, looking at everything from their violent tactics to their cartel connections, and yeah, the stuff everyone conveniently forgets about. Corruption and bribery. We're comparing them against the DEA from 2008 to 2010, which is when Breaking Bad takes place. Level 1. Blood and Terror versus Federal Reach. The Salamanca family's primary business strategy was simple: scare everyone through extreme violence, and while that sounds primitive, we need to remember that this exact strategy was working across the border during this exact time period. In 2008, the Mexican drug war was exploding into unprecedented brutality, and the cartels were winning. Let's start with Tuco. This dude operates out of sketchy warehouses and desert hideouts, has armed guards everywhere, beats people to death in broad daylight, and makes every business decision when he's high on his own product. He literally murdered one of his own guys with his bare hands because he thought the dude was disrespecting him. Now, common sense says the DEA would destroy Tuco, but here's the reality check nobody wants to talk about. In 2008, Ciudad Juarez, literally right across from the border where the Salamancas operate, began its descent into becoming the murder capital of the entire world. Violence exploded that year and would peak at over 3,600 murders in 2010 alone. The Juarez Cartel, which is who the Salamancas work for, was in a full-blown war with the Sinaloa Cartel, and they were using the exact same tactics. And you know what? It was working. The cartels weren't getting weaker in 2008, they were getting stronger. The violence wasn't their weakness, it was their greatest weapon. Because when you kill someone for talking to the cops, you're sending a message to every single person. Your family isn't safe. Your kids aren't safe. And that witness protection program the feds keep talking about, yeah, they can get you there too. Now let's talk about the cousins, Marco and Leonel. These two are at a completely different level of threat. While Tuco's out there causing chaos, the cousins are surgical. They don't lose temper, they don't make mistakes, they just execute their targets with terrifying efficiency and disappear. In Breaking Bad, we see them crawl across the desert to a shrine, murder an entire truck full of people crossing the border, kill a tribal police officer on a reservation, and carry out coordinated assassinations across multiple states, all without saying more than a handful of words. But here's where things might get interesting. That cop murder, in reality, killing any law enforcement officer brings serious heat. But killing one on tribal land actually makes it a federal crime automatically. Crimes on reservations fall under federal jurisdiction, which means the FBI gets involved immediately, not just local or state agencies. Post 9/11, that kind of murder triggers a multi-agency response. The FBI, US Marshals, DEA, and evidence. Here's what the show might not get into. By 2008, the FBI's combined DNA index system, CODIS, was fully operational. The moment the cousins leave behind some sort of evidence at a scene, the databases would link those crimes instantly. And then there's Lalo Salamanca. And honestly, he might be the most dangerous of all of them because Lalo combines Tuco's capacity for extreme violence with actual intelligence and self-control. He's charming, he's smart, he thinks ahead, and when he needs to get violent, he's absolutely brutal. Unlike Tuco, who draws attention constantly, Lalo knows when to be visible and when to disappear. He maintains a legitimate persona, he's likable, and he doesn't create unnecessary heat. What makes Lalo so dangerous for the DEA is that he's careful. The feds can build a case against someone flashy like Tuco all day long, but Lalo, he doesn't fit the profile. He looks like a successful businessman, speaks perfect English, and knows how to work a room. By the time anyone realizes what he really is, he's already 3 steps ahead. But here's the thing, even with all these advantages, they've got one fundamental problem. They're operating on US soil for significant periods. The Salamancas are running operations in Albuquerque, which means they need to be physically present in the United States, where the DEA has full authority. Winner, slight advantage to the Salamancas, but it's complicated. The violence absolutely works short term. Witnesses are too terrified to testify, and investigations hit dead ends. But terror silences witnesses. It doesn't make you invisible. Cross the border enough times, and eventually the DEA catches you through surveillance, forensics, or just dumb luck. Level 2. Corruption and cash versus DEA integrity. Okay, this is where things get really interesting, because everyone always forgets the most powerful weapon the cartels had. Money. Not just regular money, absolutely obscene, mind-blowing amounts of cash. In 2008, that money was corrupting law enforcement officers on both sides of the border like crazy. The Salamancas aren't just some random street gang, they're high-ranking members of the Juarez Cartel, an organization that by 2008 was pulling in billions of dollars every single year. That kind of money doesn't just buy drugs and guns, it buys people. Police officers, border agents, court clerks, judges, anyone with access and a price tag. Between 2005 and 2012, over 140 customs and border protection officers were arrested or convicted for corruption, taking bribes, smuggling drugs, passing information to cartels. In 2008, an ICE agent was convicted for accepting $1 million in cartel bribes. These weren't isolated incidents. The Salamancas, through their connection to the Juarez cartel, would have had direct access to these corruption networks. Now, the DEA wants everyone to believe they're completely immune to this corruption, and to be fair, DEA corruption cases are way rarer than the local police or border patrol. But rare doesn't mean never. In 2010, DEA agent Jose Irizarry began a massive corruption scheme, diverting $9 million from undercover operations while partying with these same Colombian cartels he was supposed to be investigating. The DEA didn't catch him for a decade, but the DEA in 2008 wasn't stupid. They'd been dealing with cartel corruption for decades, so they started getting smarter about it. Only a few people knew about operations. They'd conduct raids without telling local agencies until the last possible second. Winner? Call it a draw. The Salamancas could absolutely buy their way out of trouble. Tip-offs about raids, evidence that goes missing, witnesses who suddenly forget what they saw. But the DEA has been burned by cartel money before. By 2008, they knew not to trust local agencies with sensitive operations. They'd run parallel investigations, keep informants off the books. Level 3. Cartel backing versus federal pressure. Here's the elephant in the room though. The Salamancas aren't some independent operation. They're part of the Juarez cartel, and in 2008 to 2010, that protection meant something very different than it would mean today. The Juarez cartel at this time had massive operations in the United States, sophisticated logistics networks, corrupted officials on both sides of the border, and most importantly, they were willing to go to war with law enforcement. This wasn't a cartel trying to keep quiet and fly under the radar. This was an organization actively fighting the Mexican government and willing to accept enormous casualties as long as the money kept flowing. For the DEA, targeting the Salamancas meant potentially triggering cartel retaliation. And in 2008, that's not just some theoretical concern. That was a real dangerous possibility that could get agents killed. The Salamancas, backed by cartel resources, would have access to safe houses across multiple states, false identities and documents, transportation networks that could move them anywhere in the Southwest within hours, and teams of expensive lawyers who specialized in defending cartel cases. The real question becomes, would the Salamancas be important enough to the Juarez cartel to warrant the organization's full protection? Hector as a high-ranking member with decades of service? Yeah, the cartel would probably go far in protecting him. Tuco as the dude who sniffed his own product? Maybe not so much. Level 4. The cousins versus federal surveillance. Let's talk about Marco and Leonel. On the surface, it seems impossible they'd last a week. They wear matching suits everywhere, move with military precision, and leave bodies across multiple states. But here's the reality, cartel enforcers were absolutely operating in the US during this time. Los Zetas, former Mexican Special Forces soldiers turned cartel hitmen, were conducting kidnappings in Texas, murders in Arizona, and drug operations throughout the Southwest for years before most got caught. But here's where we need to update the picture. The post-9/11 intelligence infrastructure had created two key systems designed specifically for border-related crimes: Fusion Centers and EPIC. The El Paso Intelligence Center. EPIC was literally built to bridge gaps between agencies for exactly this kind of cross-border cartel activity. A murder by distinctive identical twins in matching suits in Texas, followed by another hit in New Mexico, would get flagged and connected way faster than the show suggests. The Juarez cartel controlled border crossings through bribed officials and smuggling routes, meaning the cousins could disappear into Mexico whenever things got hot. That part's still true, but their distinctive appearance is both their trademark and their downfall. Winner, Salamanca's short term, but the DEA in the long term. The cousins could operate successfully for months, maybe even a year, but eventually federal resources would identify them and they'd either get arrested or killed in a shootout, as Hank put them down. Level 5. Hector's operation versus financial tracking. Hector runs his operation through front businesses, a restaurant called El Michoacano. In Better Call Saul, he conducts business openly, meeting dealers and threatening people in public. You'd think the DEA would be all over him immediately, but the DEA was completely overwhelmed during this period. The Mexican drug war was exploding, meth was flooding the border in unprecedented quantities, and they had to prioritize. A small upholstery shop in Albuquerque wouldn't make the priority list unless something specifically triggered attention. Hector keeps a modest lifestyle, no fancy car, no mansion, nothing flashy, nothing that screams, investigate me. But here's where the real DEA would have an angle that the show doesn't explore: financial intelligence. The DEA works very closely with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and they've got tools that make cash-based operations way more vulnerable than the show suggests. First, there's the $10,000 rule. Any cash deposit over $10,000 triggers an automatic currency transaction report. But the Salamancas would know that, right? They just deposit smaller amounts. That's called structuring, and it's a federal crime in itself. The DEA would look at El Michoacano and ask, how is this small taco shop paying for commercial property and vehicles? The moment the lifestyle doesn't match the reported tax income, the IRS and DEA move in for a money laundering charge, which is often way easier to prove than a drug charge. But here's his massive advantage: experience. This guy's been operating since the 1980s. He did 17 years in San Quentin and never snitched. By 2008, he's a decades-long veteran who knows exactly which mistakes get you caught. Look at real examples. Ismael Zambada Garcia, El Mayo, operated for over 50 years without a single arrest. He wasn't caught until 2024. And even then, his partner's son had to kidnap him and fly him across the border. If El Mayo could avoid the DEA for half a century using a low profile and experience, why couldn't Hector do the same for a few years? Hector's critical weakness? His family. Tuco's getting arrested constantly. The cousins are leaving bodies everywhere. Every family member who screws up creates another investigation angle. Winner, Salamancas. Hector's experience, modest lifestyle, and eventually his disability make him a low-priority target. The DEA would probably know he's dirty, but proving it would be incredibly resource-intensive for minimal payoff. Level 6. The DEA's real playbook, what Breaking Bad doesn't show. Here's the thing about how Breaking Bad portrays DEA investigations. It's mostly physical surveillance. Hank tailing suspects, stakeouts, lucky encounters. Makes for great TV, but the real DEA's most devastating weapon barely shows up on screen: wiretaps. By 2008, the DEA wasn't just listening to phone calls. They were using pen registers to map out entire criminal networks. Even if Tuco never mentions drugs on the phone, the sheer frequency of calls between El Michoacano, Tuco's warehouse, and known cartel numbers in Mexico creates a web. That pattern alone can establish probable cause for a massive RICO case. And speaking of RICO, combined with the CCE statute, the Kingpin Act, the DEA doesn't need a witness to a specific murder. They just need to prove the Salamancas are running a continuing criminal enterprise. Link Tuco's street dealers to Hector's shop through wiretaps or financial records. You don't need the murder witness, you've got the paper trail. And then we have the snitches. The feds grab one of Tuco's street-level dealers. Maybe he's caught with an ounce of meth. No big deal, right? Wrong. Federal drug sentencing in 2008 was brutal. That street dealer is suddenly looking at a 20-year mandatory minimum. No parole. 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Now the DEA makes an offer. Help us and we'll talk to the prosecutor. The code of silence is a great concept until you're 25 years old, staring at walking out of prison at 45. Under that kind of pressure, the code usually breaks. The DEA calls it climbing the ladder. You flip the street dealer to get to the mid-level distributor. You flip him to get someone closer to Tuco. Eventually, someone decides that 20 years isn't worth protecting a guy who might kill you anyway. Conclusion: it's way closer than you think. When you honestly assess the Salamanca's operation against the real DEA of 2008 and 2010, it's way more complicated than DEA crushes them immediately. The Salamancas had genuine advantages: cartel resources, corruption networks, witness intimidation, decades of experience, and the chaos of the Mexican drug war as cover. Here's something wild. During this exact period, the DEA and ATF were running Operation Fast and Furious, literally letting guns walk across the border into cartel hands to track them. One of those guns killed Border Patrol agent Brian Terry in 2010. Federal agencies weren't just struggling against cartels, they were making catastrophic mistakes that got their own people killed. Would the Salamancas eventually get caught? Absolutely. Even in the show, Tuco gets arrested twice before Hank kills him. The cousins get killed by Hank, but eventually might mean years, not months. El Chapo escaped prison twice before they locked him up for good. El Mayo operated for decades before getting caught in 2024, and even then, his own people betrayed him, not some brilliant DEA operation. The Salamancas are way too loud and violent to last that long, but real cartel cells operate successfully throughout this period. But the real lesson, the war on drugs in the late 2000s wasn't law enforcement dominance, it was brutal. Corruption and violence worked until suddenly they didn't. The bad guys operated successfully way longer than anyone wants to admit, and they still do to this day. The Salamancas would probably fall eventually, but they take a lot of people down with them first. And honestly, that's not a victory for anyone.